The twin suns of Viridia hung low in the morning sky, their amber light spilling across the settlement of New Haven and casting long shadows over the wall that surrounded it. The wall was a constant presence in Morgan Hayes' life, towering and unyielding, a reminder of both safety and confinement. To most, it meant protection from the wilderness beyond. To Morgan, it was a challenge and invitation whispered in stone and steel. He had grown up staring at it, daring it with his eyes, wondering what lay beyond its cold, impassible face. At 15, Morgan carried himself with the stubborn pride of someone who had lost too much, too soon. Since his mother's death 3 years earlier, the mischievous gleam in his hazel eyes had sharpened into something reckless, a hunger to push boundaries. His father, Daniel Hayes, had buried himself in his work at the colony's power facility, leaving Morgan with lectures about rules and safety, but not much else. Safety, Morgan thought, was just another word for stagnation. He crouched low behind a stand of purple-leaf shrubs, the dew still clinging to their wide leaves, watching the eastern section of the wall where he liked to hide from the eyes of the settlement's drones. He knew the routines of their patrols well enough to slip into blind spots. The air smelled different here, fresher somehow, touched by the wild. His fingers brushed the cool stone of the wall, and that was when he saw. It's something new. A crack dot at first. He thought it was a trick of the light, a line of shadow where there should be none. But when he leaned closer, his breath caught in his throat. A fracture ran from the ground upward, narrow but unmistakable. He pressed his palm against it and felt a faint stirring of air. It hadn't been there yesterday. Heart thudding. He crouched lower, tracing the line of the fissure. It was just wide enough that, if he turned sideways, he might be able to squeeze through. He should have reported it. His father's voice echoed in his head. Stay within the settlement boundaries. The ecosystem hasn't been catalogued. It's not safe. Yet the thought of telling anyone meant they would seal it, erase it, and the mystery would vanish before his eyes. A rustling noise snapped his attention back to the crack. Something moved. He stumbled back as a creature emerged, its body small but alien in every line and detail. Fur like liquid cobalt shimmered against the dawn light. Its shape was almost familiar, canine, wolf-like, but its features sharper, more angular, with small ridges of scale-like protrusions running down its spine. Its eyes were the most arresting thing of all, wide, intelligent, and the color of polished copper. Morgan froze. The creature tilted its head, regarding him with a curiosity that mirrored his own. For a moment, boy and beast studied each other, in perfect stillness. Then the creature gave a soft, chirping trill, high and almost bird-like, before retreating back into the crack. Wait, Morgan whispered, his fear dissolving into something else entirely: excitement, wonder, a tug he couldn't resist. He dropped to his knees and peered through the opening. On the other side, the creature stood a few feet away, glancing back at him with an unmistakable invitation. He knew this was foolish. He knew what his father would say, what the council would say, what every authority in New Haven would demand. Report it, seal it, forget it. But Morgan's pulse thundered with a different command. This was what he had always longed for, the unknown waiting just out of reach. The creature chirped again, softer this time, almost like encouragement. Morgan set his jaw. He pressed his shoulder against the crack, turned sideways, and forced himself through. The wall scraped at his back, snagging his shirt, but then he was through, stumbling onto soil that felt the same, smelled the same, but carried a strange energy, wilder, freer. The air filled his lungs with a freshness he had never known inside. The settlement. The cobalt-furred creature waited, copper eyes gleaming in the light of the rising suns. It gave a low purring sound, then trotted ahead with a confidence that left no doubt. It wanted him to follow. Morgan glanced once over his shoulder at the towering wall, that great barrier of fear and authority that had defined his life. Then, he turned back toward the creature and stepped forward, knowing with a thrill in his chest that nothing would ever be the same again. The creature led Morgan with a kind of purpose that unsettled him, as though this wasn't a chance encounter at all, but something planned. Its small, lithe body slipped easily between the boulders and brush, pausing now and again to glance back at him, copper eyes glowing in the dawn. Morgan stumbled after it, his boots crunching against the reddish soil, his breath quick with anticipation. Every step carried him deeper into a world he had only ever imagined. The air outside the wall was sharper, filled with scents of blooming vines and damp earth, layered with something muskier that hinted of creatures he had never seen. Strange plants rose along the ravine, some with leaves spiraling upward like corkscrews, others with flowers that pulsed faintly, almost as if breathing. Morgan reached out to brush one, only to pull back when it quivered under his touch. The creature stopped suddenly, crouching low near a tumble of rocks. Morgan followed its gaze, and his heart lurched out. An enormous form lay half hidden beneath a slab of stone, its cobalt fur dulled with dust, its body tense with pain. Larger than any wolf or big cat Morgan had ever seen, the creature was clearly the same kind as the juvenile and adult, with the rigid scales more pronounced along its spine and powerful limbs that twitched against the rock, pinning one hind leg. Its copper eyes locked on him with a mixture of fear and fury, and a low growl vibrated through the ravine. The juvenile, the one who had led him here, let out a series of urgent chirps and bounded to the adult's side. It nudged the larger creature gently, then turned to Morgan with a look that was almost pleading. Morgan froze. This was insane. Every survival manual he'd ever skimmed warned of what to do if confronted with an alien predator. Retreat, report, never engage. His father's voice pounded in his head, warning of disease, of danger, of rules. Yet standing here, looking into the intelligent copper eyes of both creatures, he didn't see predators. He saw family. One wounded, one desperate, and both relying on him. "You want me to help," he murmured, the words spilling out before he thought better of them. The adult let out a sharp rumble, more warning than welcome, but it didn't lash out. That gave him courage. Morgan moved slowly, hands spread to show he carried no weapon. He circled the fallen slab, examining it. The rock had crashed down at an angle. One edge caught against another boulder, creating a wedge that held most of its weight. With the right leverage, he scanned the ground, spotting a thick branch, weathered but sturdy. He dragged it over, heart hammering, aware of the adult's watchful gaze and the juvenile's hopeful chirps. Wedges and fulcrums, he thought, remembering lessons his father had drilled into him about basic mechanics. If he could just shift the weight. He shoved the branch beneath the slab and threw his weight against it. The wood creaked, muscles in, his arms and back straining. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding groan, the stone shifted. "Come on," Morgan gasped. Sweat trickled down his temple as he pushed harder, legs trembling with effort. At last the slab lifted just enough. The adult gave a startled jerk, then yanked its leg. Free, with a desperate surge of strength. The slab crashed back into place, sending dust billowing into the air. Morgan staggered, dropping the branch, his chest heaving. The adult scrambled back, limping but free, its fur bristling. The juvenile chirped joyfully, bounding around both of them. For a long moment, Morgan thought the adult might turn on him. It loomed close, copper eyes glowing. Then, slowly, cautiously, it lowered its massive head and pressed its muzzle against his outstretched hand. A shiver ran through him, not of fear, but awe. Gratitude radiated from the creature, raw and unmistakable. "You're welcome," Morgan whispered, his voice trembling. The juvenile yipped and spun in circles, the sound almost like laughter. Morgan felt something swell inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a connection, fragile and impossible, but real. When he finally turned to glance back toward the wall, he realized the two creatures were following him. A thrill of fear flickered in his chest, but it was chased away by something stronger, wonder. Whatever line had separated his world from theirs, he had just stepped across it. And there would be no turning back. By the time Morgan squeezed back through the narrow crack in the wall, his mind was racing faster than his feet. The settlement looked unchanged, the same neat rows of prefab houses, the same hum of distant machinery, the same drones gliding overhead. Yet everything felt different now. He carried a secret no one inside these walls would ever believe, let alone accept. He barely heard his father's stern words when Daniel confronted him later that day, barely felt the sting of punishment as he was sent to his room. The images of copper eyes and cobalt fur wouldn't leave his mind, and the way the adult had pressed its muzzle against his hand, that was no wild animal's act. That was trust, but Daniel Hayes wasn't interested in trust. You broke the law, his father had thundered. You endangered yourself, and possibly all of us. Morgan had tried to explain, but Daniel had shut him down. They're animals, you're projecting. This conversation is over. Fury and disappointment burned in his chest as he stormed from the house later, slipping between prefab units until he reached the community garden. That's where he always ended up when he needed space. The air was cooler here, scented with the tongue of soil and blossoms. He sank onto a bench, his fists tight at his sides. Morgan? Her voice was soft, but carried easily on the evening air. He looked up to see Asara approaching, her silvery hair catching the fading light, violet, eyes filled with concern. She was Verixie, one of the colony's allies, but more importantly, she was his friend, the one person who had never laughed. When he confided his restless dreams, "You look like you're about to punch the sky," she teased gently. Morgan hesitated, then the words came pouring out. The crack in the wall, the strange creature, the larger one trapped beneath the stone. How he'd freed it, and how they had looked at him not like prey, but like something more. Asura listened without interrupting, her eyes widening as his story unfolded. When he finally trailed off, he braced for the disbelief, the laughter. Instead, she whispered, "My grandmother told me stories about creatures who lived beyond the wall. Guardians, she called them. Most humans dismiss those tales as myths." Morgan leaned forward, hope sparking. "But you believe me?" She smiled, faint but certain. "I believe you. And if you want, I'll come with you tomorrow. I want to see them for myself." Relief flooded him so suddenly he almost laughed. For the first time since crawling through the wall, he didn't feel alone. The next dawn came too slowly. Morgan lay awake most of the night, turning over plans in his head, listening to the faint hum of the settlement beyond his window. At first light he was already dressed, backpack slung over his shoulder, heart pounding with anticipation. Asara was waiting in the garden, a small pack of her own on her back. She wore a simple gray dress edged with silver, the colors making her turquoise skin glow in the early light. "Ready?" she asked, her smile both nervous and excited. "Not a chance I'd miss this," Morgan replied, though a flicker of guilt twisted in his stomach at the thought of dragging her into danger. Still, she stood taller than he felt, her violet eyes shining with resolve. They slipped through the silent streets, avoiding the gaze of drones, until the towering wall loomed above them once again. The fracture was still there, unsealed, as though waiting for them. Morgan squeezed through first, and helped Asara after him. The wilderness air washed over them, wild and alive. They didn't have to wait long. A familiar chirp echoed through the brush, and then the cobalt-furred juvenile bounded into view. Its fur shimmered in the morning light as it stopped short, tilting its head at Asara. "It's beautiful," she whispered, awe thick in her voice. Morgan grinned. "He's friendly. Watch." The creature sniffed the air, circling them both, before trilling in what sounded like approval. Its copper eyes shone with recognition, and it pawed the ground eagerly before darting ahead a few steps and looking back expectantly. As Sarah knelt, her violet eyes soft. "What should we call it?" Morgan blinked. He hadn't thought of naming it. "I don't know. Something that fits." "Cobalt," she said, smiling at the gleam of its fur. The creature perked up at the sound, trilling again as if in agreement. "Cobalt it is," Morgan laughed. But even as the name took root, the juvenile darted ahead again, chirping insistently. It wasn't just playing, it was leading them deeper into the unknown. Morgan glanced at Asara, excitement and nerves mingling in his chest. "You ready?" Her smile widened, fierce with anticipation. "More than ready." And together, side by side, they followed Cobalt into the wilderness, unaware that what awaited them would unravel everything they thought they knew about their world. Morgan had never felt so alive as he did following Cobalt into the wild. Juvenile moved like a streak of blue fire through the undergrowth, weaving between twisted trees and ridges of stone. Every so often it glanced back, chirping to make sure its strange new companions were still with it. Asara walked close beside Morgan, her eyes darting over every plant and stone, her fingers brushing at leaves with a scholar's curiosity. To her, this wasn't just adventure, it was discovery. They walked until the settlement wall was no longer visible, swallowed by the rolling terrain. The air grew cooler here, touched with a spice-like fragrance that clung to the moss under their feet. Ahead, a ridge of dark stone rose, its surface veined with streaks of faintly glowing mineral. Cobalt scrambled up easily, then disappeared into a gap masked by hanging vines. Morgan parted the vines and gasped. A cavern opened before them, bathed in a soft blue glow from luminescent crystals embedded in the walls. The air was cool and hushed, like stepping into a cathedral. But it wasn't the light that made his throat tighten. It was the drawings. Covering the walls, etched deep and weathered with age, were crude but unmistakable images. Figures with tall, slender forms like the Verixi. Shapes of humans in simple suits, blocky and clumsy compared to the others. And always, beside both, the cobalt creatures larger and smaller, standing shoulder to shoulder, fighting alongside. Them against beasts that Morgan couldn't identify. "This," Asara whispered, her voice trembling, "these are ancient. Look at the erosion, the mineral deposits in the grooves. They're hundreds of years old." Morgan moved closer, his fingers hovering over a depiction of humans building a structure, with the cobalt creatures watching. "But that doesn't make sense. Humans have only been on Viridia for 60 years. The wall has always been here." Asara's violet eyes glistened with awe. "Not always. My grandmother told me the Verixi once lived freely across these lands, long before your people came. She said they had allies, protectors. No one believed her. But, Morgan, look." Cobalt chirped loudly, bounding to the back of the cavern where a shallow alcove was lined with soft blue-green moss. Nestled within were 3 oval shapes. There. Shells smooth and faintly glowing. Eggs. Russets. Morgan felt his breath catch. He suddenly understood the urgency in Cobalt's eyes, the weight of what they had been led to. This wasn't just a cave. It was a nursery. Russet emerged from the shadows then, limping slightly, but standing tall, her copper eyes fixed on them. Both. She positioned herself protectively before the eggs, her muscles tense, her gaze sharp. Asara stepped forward cautiously, her voice soft and reverent. "She's a mother," Morgan nodded, his pulse thundering. He remembered freeing her from the stone, the way she had pressed her muzzle to his hand. Not just gratitude, trust. Now she was allowing them into her most sacred space for several long moments. The silence was unbroken, but for the faint drip of mineral-rich water down the cavern walls. And Russet's gaze shifted, softening slightly, as though recognizing that these two outsiders weren't here to harm her. She gave a low, thrumming sound, deep and resonant, and Cobalt answered with a playful trill. Asara's voice trembled. "Do you realize what this means? These creatures, they're intelligent. They have history, culture, family, and the Council. The Council knows nothing." Morgan swallowed hard. "If they knew, they'd seal the wall. They'd take the eggs. They'd study them until nothing was left." Asara looked at him, her violet eyes burning. "Then we can't tell them, not yet." Before Morgan could answer, a sound broke the fragile peace, the mechanical hum of drones. Faint, distant, but growing closer. He felt a cold weight settle. In his stomach, his father had reported the breach. Security was coming. Russet stiffened, her copper eyes narrowing as the sound drew nearer. She made a sharp warning growl and pulled Cobalt back toward the nest. Morgan turned to Asara, fear and determination mingling in his chest. "We have to get back before they find us here." Asara's jaw tightened. "And if they do? If they find the eggs?" Morgan looked at Russet, at Cobalt, at the ancient drawings on the walls. A fire lit inside him that he hadn't felt since the day his mother died. "Then we make sure they don't." But even as he spoke, the whir of drones grew louder, echoing off the cavern walls, a promise of danger closing in. The whirring grew louder, bouncing off the cavern walls, until it felt like the sound was crawling across Morgan's skin. He end. Asara exchanged a terrified glance. Russet pressed herself low over the eggs, wings flaring slightly, as if she could shield them from everything the outside world might bring. Cobalt stood by her side, fur bristling, copper eyes flashing. Morgan grabbed Asara's wrist. "We need to go now." They retraced their steps quickly, Cobalt chirping urgently as if sensing the danger. The vines at the cave's entrance swayed with the breeze, but beyond them, the faint glimmer of searchlights swept across the terrain. Two security drones hovered above the ridge, sleek and black, their lenses rotating in perfect mechanical rhythm. "Late," Morgan whispered. Asara's violet eyes darted to him. "They'll find the nest." Morgan's heart pounded as he scanned the ravine. The Council would take the eggs, just as Asara had feared. They'd call it study, but Morgan could already imagine the cold glass cages, the endless prodding, and tests. Cobalt and Russet wouldn't be treated as family, or even as living beings. They'd become specimens. Something inside him snapped. "We're not letting that happen," he said fiercely. Before Asara could respond, a sharp light burst into the cave, flooding them with white glare. A drone had spotted movement and sent a beam of light slicing through the shadows. Morgan threw himself sideways, pulling Asara down with him. The beam passed inches from them, the heat of its sensors prickling his skin. "We can't fight them," Asara whispered, panic rising in her voice. "No," Morgan said, his chest heaving. "But we can beat them." They waited for the light to sweep past and scramble deeper into the cavern. Behind them, Russet gave a deep growl, her voice echoing with primal warning. She herded Cobalt close to the eggs, shielding them with her body. The drones pressed closer, beams cutting through the vines, mechanical whirring filling the space. And then a sound pierced the air, a shriek so sharp it seemed to split stone. Cobalt. The juvenile's cry was high-pitched, desperate, and filled with urgency. It wasn't random. It was calling. The air shifted. Shadows stirred. From fissures in the cavern walls, from hidden burrows among the rocks, more cobalt shapes emerged. At first 2, then 5, then a dozen. Their eyes glowed copper in the dim light, and their bodies shimmered with that same strange, rippling fur. They surrounded the drones in silence, their movements not chaotic, but precise, coordinated, like soldiers who had trained for this moment their entire lives. One leaped, jaws snapping onto a drone. Sparks burst, and the machine went crashing to the ground. Another lunged upward, wings unfurling just enough to slam a second drone against the cavern ceiling. The whirring turned into shrieks of failing machinery. Within seconds, the drones were wreckage on the cavern floor. Morgan's mouth had gone dry. His mind screamed at him to run, but his heart knew better. This wasn't random aggression. This was defense, protection, family. There, organized, Asara breathed, awe shimmering in her voice. They fight like a society. Russet gave a low call, and the new arrivals answered in unison. A sound reverberated through the cave, deep and melodic, like a hymn sung by an army. Then silence fell again, save for the faint crackle of ruined drones. Morgan forced himself to stand, his knees shaking. He stepped forward cautiously, raising his hands. The Luminar, yes, that was the word that leapt into his mind. Luminar watched him intently. Russet moved toward him, her copper gaze steady. She lowered her head, not just in gratitude this time, but in recognition. As if, in that moment, he was no longer just an intruder from behind the wall. He was something else. "Morgan," Asara whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you understand what just happened?" He nodded, unable to tear his eyes from Russet's. "They're not animals. They never were." Behind them, one of the eggs stirred, a faint glow pulsing across its shell. A crack spidered along the surface. Russet crooned low and soft, nudging the egg with her muzzle. The shell shuddered again, and before Morgan could catch his breath, the egg split, a tiny head emerging, scales glistening weightly in the crystal light. The hatchling gave a weak chirp, its voice fragile but alive. Morgan's chest tightened. First the wall, then cobalt, then the drawings. Now this. Every step deeper into the wilderness pulled him further from everything the settlement had ever told him was true. The wall was supposed to protect them from danger, but all it had done was hide the truth, and the truth was about to tear New Havens. Lies apart, the hatchling's frail chirps filled the cavern like fragile notes of music, echoing against the glowing stone. Russet lowered her massive head to nuzzle the newborn, her copper eyes soft, brimming with the tenderness Morgan recognized. Instantly, it was the same look his father sometimes gave him when he thought no one was watching. The tiny creature squirmed free of its shell, its damp wings clinging to its sides as it blinked into the dim light. Morgan couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His heart hammered as if it wanted to break free from his chest. He had watched life emerge from an egg older than the colony itself. He had seen beings fight with strategy, protect their own with unity. And now he had witnessed bird-proof undeniable that these creatures weren't beasts lurking beyond the wall. They were something far greater. Asara pressed closer to him, her violet eyes shining in the soft blue glow. "The Council has lied," she whispered. "They've always known, or at least suspected. Otherwise, why build a wall so high? Why make contact with my people sound like the first and only truth? These stories, these caves." Her voice faltered as her gaze drifted to the glowing walls. Morgan followed her eyes and suddenly saw details he hadn't noticed before. The crude drawings weren't just scattered. They were organized, sequential, a history etched in stone. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against the cold wall. Figures danced there in faded lines, Verixie and Luminar together, building fires, sharing food. In another panel, humans appeared, their bulky suits unmistakable. At first, they stood beside the others, exchanging tools, working side by side. But then came the darker lines images of walls being raised, Luminar pushed to the edges, Verixy. Divided, some standing with the humans, others cast out. His throat tightened. This isn't a myth. This is history. Cobalt chirped suddenly, bounding toward a darker corner of the cavern. Russet rumbled, as if giving permission. Morgan and Asara followed, ducking under a jagged arch of stone. There, in a hollow alcove shielded from the rest of the cave, lay objects wrapped in dried moss and leather-like material. Tools, containers, and a tablet human in design, its screen dark but intact. Dust coated its surface, but when Morgan touched it, the screen flickered weakly to life. His breath caught. A face appeared. Familiar. Mom. The word slipped out like a ghost. Catherine Hayes, his mother, stared back at him from the grainy display, her expression drawn but determined. Her voice came through faint, broken by static, yet every word struck like thunder. Research log, day 247. The Luminar continued to demonstrate remarkable intelligence, empathy, and structured society. The Council refuses to acknowledge this, insisting they be classified as indigenous fauna. I know the truth. I have evidence. Tomorrow, I present my findings. If they refuse to act, I will contact the Interstellar Ethics Committee. This wall must come down. The recording ended. Silence crashed down. Morgan staggered back, the tablet slipping from his hands. His chest heaved, his pulse roaring in his ears. His mother hadn't died in an accident at the power facility. She had been silenced, because she had tried to expose the truth. Asara's hand found his arm, grounding him. Her voice was a whisper, heavy with grief and fury. She knew. She tried to protect them, protect all of us. Morgan's legs trembled as the realization clawed through him. They killed her because she wanted the truth out. A sound drew his attention. One of the elder Luminars had stepped forward, its fur faded to silver with age, its copper eyes ancient and solemn. In its claws, it held something small, an identification badge. Weathered, the name still visible. Catherine Hayes. The elder pressed it gently into Morgan's palm, then lowered its head as if recognizing him, as if saying, "We remember her. We have been waiting for you." Tears blurred his vision, hot and stinging. For the first time since she died, since he thought she had left him, he felt her presence again, not in memory, but here, in the truth she had fought to uncover. Asara's voice was steady now, though her violet eyes glistened. This changes everything, Morgan. The Council won't be able to bury this again. Not with you, not with us. Morgan closed his hand around the badge, his jaw hardening with resolve. Then we finish what she started. Russet rumbled low, a sound of approval. Cobalt chirped, darting toward him, brushing against his leg as if pledging loyalty. The hatchling gave a tiny, trembling cry, answered by the chorus of elders in the cavern. Morgan raised his head. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a restless boy staring at a wall. He was his mother's son. And he had a mission now afire. No wall, no council. No lies could contain Dot. The suns were setting by the time Morgan, Asara, and Daniel returned to the settlement. The walk back had been silent, each of them weighed down by the enormity of what they had seen. Morgan still clutched his mother's badge, its worn surface warm from his grip, while Daniel carried the human tablet loaded with Catherine Hayes' suppressed research. It felt like they were carrying not just evidence, but a spark powerful enough to ignite an entire world. New Haven looked the same on the outside prefab houses lined in neat rows, drones humming overhead, the steady rhythm of machinery. But Morgan could no longer see it the same way. Every wall, every streetlight, every regulation felt like part of a prison built on lies. Governor Sullivan listened first. Inside his residence, Morgan and Asara poured out the truth, the Luminars. Society, the Cave of History, Catherine Hayes recordings. Sullivan's salt and pepper brows drew lower with each word. When Daniel placed the tablet on his desk, the governor leaned in, his expression shifting from doubt to grim realization as Catherine's voice filled the room. The council silenced. "This," Sullivan murmured, his voice almost a growl. "And they've kept it buried for decades." His eyes flicked to Daniel. "If this reaches the Interstellar Ethics Committee, the Mercer's hold over this settlement ends tonight." The plan was simple, but dangerous. Daniel would secure the communications array to transmit the evidence off-world, while Morgan and Asara took what they had directly to the governor in case the council tried to intercept. For hours they moved, like shadows through maintenance corridors, evading guards who seemed to know something was unraveling. At the Northern Array facility, their fears were confirmed. Council-loyal officers had locked the place down. Dr. Mercer himself stood inside, shouting at engineers to override safeguards. But when Sullivan arrived with security, Chief Lawson, and a team wearing the insignia of the Colonial Authority, not the Council, the tide shifted. "Governors override," Sullivan said, his voice cutting like a blade. "This facility is now under direct authority of the Colonial Office. Step aside." The confrontation was quick and sharp. Mercer was dragged from the control room, spitting curses about indigenous beasts and scientific progress. Morgan watched him go, his stomach turning cold. Mercer's words reminded him exactly what was at stake. To the Council, the Luminar weren't people. They were obstacles. Daniel's hands moved with the surety of a man who knew machines better than his own heart. The transmission lit the room with a blue glow, sending Catherine Hayes' words, and the archive scans across the void of space. When the console chimed completion, Daniel slumped back, his face pale but triumphant. "It's done," he said softly. "The Ethics Committee has everything. They'll have no choice but to act." The weeks that followed tore New Haven apart. Revelations of the cover-up spread through the settlement like wildfire. Verixie elders stepped forward, sharing stories of the Luminar Blue Guardians. They called them, who had lived alongside their people before the humans arrived. Colonists who had spent years staring at the wall in fear now stared at it with suspicion of a different kind. A month later, the Ethics Committee's response arrived in full force. Investigators, mediators, and the decree that changed everything. The Luminar were to be recognized as a sentient species under galactic law. The wall was to be dismantled, and New Haven would become the first tri-species cooperative zone in the sector. Morgan stood with Asara and Daniel at the eastern wall the day it came down. Workers had already dismantled huge sections, leaving a wide opening where wilderness and settlement met. A delegation of Luminar waited on the other side, Russet at their head, Cobalt chirping excitedly at the sight of Morgan. Ember, the hatchling, clung awkwardly to her side, wings twitching as it tried to keep up. Governor Sullivan stepped forward first, bowing his head in the Luminar fashion Morgan had shown him. "On behalf of humanity, we offer greetings and apologies for the wrongs of the past. We seek a new beginning, one of trust, not walls." The Luminar leader, silver-marked and imposing, raised its head high. A ripple of melodic notes poured from its throat, deep and resonant. An elderly Verixie stepped forward to translate. "They accept your greeting. They say they have waited many generations for this day." Morgan barely heard the formalities. He was already on his knees, arms open, as Cobalt bounded toward him with a trill of joy. Ember toddled close behind, wobbling before tumbling into his lap. Warmth filled his chest as Russet lowered her head, pressing her muzzle against his shoulder. In a gesture that was no longer just gratitude, it was kinship. Daniel stood behind him, his weathered face softened by pride and grief. "Your mother would be proud, Morgan," he said quietly. "She believed this day would come. You made it real." Morgan swallowed hard, his hand tightening on Ember's tiny form. "No, Dad, she made it real. I just finished what she started." The Luminar's evening song began then, dozens of voices weaving together in a haunting, beautiful harmony that filled the twilight air. Humans and Verixi fell silent, listening as though the song itself rewove the torn fabric of history. For Morgan, the moment was more than history. It was personal. He had crossed a wall one morning, reckless and restless, and discovered a secret that changed everything. Not just for himself, or for the Luminar, but for all who lived under these twin suns. As the song swelled, Ember pressed its tiny head against his chest, and Cobalt curled protectively at his side. Morgan lifted his gaze to the stars, where the Ethics Committee's message was surely already echoing outward into the galaxy. Humanity's greatest strength had never been its walls, its machines, or its rules. It was compassion, the ability to recognize intelligence, worth, and kinship in the eyes of the other. That was his mother's legacy. That was the gift he would carry forward, and as the wall crumbled behind him, Morgan knew there would be no more boundaries between them, only beginnings.